Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The cold November rain had been falling for 3 straight days, turning the streets of Millbrook, Ohio into rivers of mud and reflected streetlights. Michael Thompson trudged through the soggy mess, not caring where his feet took him. He'd lost his umbrella that morning, or maybe he'd just forgotten it. What did it matter now? Water streamed down his face, mixing with the tears he no longer bothered to hide. His world had collapsed. In his head, one name hammered like a relentless drumbeat: David Harrison. Former best friend, godfather to little Emma, business partner, traitor. The man who had orchestrated an elaborate scheme behind Michael's back, emptying every account, liquidating all assets from their once thriving construction company, leaving Michael with nothing but fraudulent contracts, millions in debt to suppliers and banks, and a reputation as a con man. Thompson Construction, the company he'd built brick by brick over the last 12 years, his baby, his pride, gone to dust in just 2 weeks. And then Jessica, his light, his breath, couldn't take it anymore. She'd packed her bags, taken their 6-year-old daughter Emma, and left. "I can't do this anymore, Michael. You've become someone else. Angry, haunted, obsessed with revenge. You don't eat, you don't sleep, you just mutter curses about David. I don't want Emma to see this. I'm sorry." Sorry, easy word to say. She'd gone to her mother's cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town, leaving him alone in their spacious house that had once been filled with laughter, where every corner now screamed reminders of her, of Emma, of the life that no longer existed. He would have given anything to go back to that day when he'd blindly trusted David, signed those damned papers. He'd been walking aimlessly for hours, his feet carrying him through winding side streets until he found himself in the old, nearly abandoned part of town. Here, streetlights were sparse, and decrepit 2-story houses stared at the world through the empty sockets of broken windows. The rain seemed colder here, more vicious. The air reeked of dampness, mold, and despair. And it was here, squeezed between a crumbling brick wall with peeling paint and a sagging fence, that a small shop crouched in the shadows. Tiny, unremarkable, with a dimly glowing window display filled with unclear junk. A cracked vase, a brass candlestick of strange design, a stack of yellowed postcards, an eyeless doll. Above the door hung a faded, barely legible sign: Odds and Ends Antiques. Something inexplicable, some irrational pull, a desperate curiosity of a doomed man, drew Michael to the door. He grabbed the heavy brass handle. A bell above the door let out a rasping, mournful sound, as if complaining about the intrusion. Inside, it smelled of dust, age, wax, and something else. Something sweetly sickening that sent a chill down his spine. The space was crammed with items from floor to ceiling. Antique furniture with cracked lacquer, tarnished mirrors in heavy carved frames reflecting distorted shadows, clocks of all kinds, some stopped, others ticking out of rhythm, creating a nerve-wracking cacophony. Porcelain dolls with empty, watching eyes. Books in decayed bindings with incomprehensible symbols on their spines. Candelabras, jewelry boxes, rusty weapons, strange mechanisms. It seemed as if artifacts from hundreds of forgotten lives had gathered here, each item holding its own dark secret. Shadows danced in the corners, and the ticking of clocks reminded him of time counting down to something inevitable. From behind a tall counter piled with yellowed papers, dusty items, and strange objects like a dried animal's paw or a murky glass orb, a head appeared. Sparse gray hair gathered in an indecisive ponytail, deep-set, almost colorless eyes under thick brows, and a face that was a network of wrinkles, parchment skin stretched over a skull. The old man was incredibly short, almost dwarf-like, and moved with a limp, favoring one leg. He wore an old, worn velvet vest over an equally shabby shirt of indeterminate color. "What brings you, young man?" His voice was creaky, like an unoiled door hinge, but surprisingly strong, penetrating under the skin. "Looking for something specific or just curious? We've got all sorts here for all sorts of needs." Michael looked around uncertainly, feeling uncomfortable under the gaze of eyeless dolls and dim mirrors. He didn't even know why he'd entered. "I don't know," he mumbled, shaking water from his jacket onto the worn carpet under his feet. "Just walking by, saw the light." The old man looked at him intently, unpleasantly, piercingly. His small eyes seemed to see right through Michael, reading all his pain and rage. "Very bad times, yes," he said unexpectedly, tilting his head slightly. "I can see it in your eyes. They've gone out as if life has left them, and anger churns there, black and bitter." Michael flinched at such insight. How could he know? In his chest, that familiar knot of hot hatred toward David stirred again, and suddenly, unexpectedly even to himself, he began to speak. Words poured out on their own, jumbled, desperate, angry, as if a dam of days of silence had burst. He told this strange old man everything. About David's betrayal, how he'd cynically smiled and shaken his hand the day before disappearing with the money. About the collapsed business, calls from furious creditors, threats, Jessica and Emma leaving. The deafening emptiness of his house and soul that had opened up inside and out. He spoke, choking on words and fury. The old man listened silently, not interrupting, only occasionally nodding his wrinkled head. In his colorless eyes was neither sympathy nor judgment, only some ancient, frightening, all-knowing understanding. When Michael fell silent, emptied and broken, but with bitter satisfaction from having spoken, the old man slowly nodded again. "Yes, indeed," he drawled in his creaky voice. "A friend's betrayal is a low blow, and when family leaves too, anyone would break. Fate's a cruel mistress sometimes, writes such twisted plots. Want to fix everything. Get back what was, or even better, punish the guilty." Michael looked at him with bitter disbelief. "What are you talking about? It's impossible. The business can't be resurrected. David's probably abroad now, living it up. Jessica won't come back. In this world, young man, almost anything is possible." The old man smirked, showing uneven yellow teeth. "It's just a matter of price and the right tools. I have something here for special cases. Not for everyone, only for those who are truly on the edge. Previous owners ended differently, but they got what they wanted. Oh yes." With his limping gait, he disappeared behind a tall bookshelf stocked with dusty tomes marked with symbols on their spines. A minute later, he returned holding a small box. It was made of black material like obsidian itself, and covered with complex, incomprehensible carvings. The symbols on it seemed to move slightly, change shape, pulse with barely noticeable inner light when you tried to focus on them. The box was cold to the touch, unnaturally cold. This cold penetrated through clothing, and from it came a barely perceptible vibration, as if a tiny heart beat inside. Here the old man held it out to Michael. Unusual thing. The ancients say it can grant 4 wishes, any wishes. Return the lost, punish the guilty, gain wealth, whatever the heart desires. Almost anything you want. Michael took the box skeptically. It was unexpectedly heavy, as if inside was not air but frozen darkness. The cold burned his fingers. 4 wishes? You're joking. What is this, some fairy tale about genies? Complete nonsense. Fairy tales are lies, but they hint at truth. The old man smirked again, a strange fire flashing in his eyes. This is something else. Ancient powers, not always kind, but mighty. They listen to those who ask correctly and who are ready to pay the price. Price? What price? Michael grew wary, remembering the old man's hint about the fate of previous owners. Everything has a price, young man, the old man answered evasively, running a bony finger over the box's surface. Every coin has 2 sides. For light, you pay with shadow. For joy, with sorrow. The law of balance, so to speak. But when you stand on the edge of an abyss, do you think about how much the rope costs that someone throws you? You just grab it. He was right, damn it. Michael was at rock bottom. It couldn't get worse. Or could it? But the thought of David choking on his own sins, of Jessica and Emma being near again, of him being master of his life again instead of a hunted bankrupt, that thought overshadowed all doubts, all common sense. This was a chance. Insane, unreal, but a chance. The only one. How do I ask? Michael's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The old man came closer, almost right up to him, lowering his voice to a whisper. His breath smelled of dust, staleness, and something else, elusive and unpleasant. It's not just words, it's a ritual. You need complete darkness. A room without windows, or all windows must be tightly curtained with the thickest fabric you can find. Cover all mirrors with anything, even rags. They don't like reflections. Put 7 hearts on a table in the center of the room. Chicken ones will do, fresh only, not frozen. Arrange them in a circle. The old man paused, his eyes gleaming predatorily. Then sprinkle them with your blood, just a little, a few drops on each heart. Blood is the key, the signature on the contract, so to speak. He handed Michael a yellow, dusty scrap of paper with strange words written in crude, angular handwriting. Shadow of night, with blood I call, come 7, fulfill my will. Say it 3 times, clearly and loudly, and wait, they will come. 7 figures, don't try to see their faces. You won't see them anyway, and you shouldn't. They hover above the ground. Don't fear their power, but fear their essence. Tell them your wish, one at a time, clearly and precisely. If they agree, the answer will be immediate. It will be fulfilled. After that, they disappear, and the wish begins to come true. Remember, only 4 wishes total. 4 times you can call them. 4 blood signatures, no more. Use them wisely or unwisely, as you wish. Michael looked alternately at the icy box, at the old man with his frightening smirk, at the paper with the incantation. His head was spinning. This was pure madness, a violation of all laws of nature and common sense. But what did he have to lose? His life was already destroyed. How much does this cost? He asked, clutching the box. For you, almost nothing. The old man named a laughable sum that would barely buy a cup of coffee. Consider it a gift. I'm giving it away. I have no use for it. I got mine and paid, and I see you need it more. Just remember, young man, he lowered his voice again, and it carried not only warning but mocking undertones. Free cheese is only in mousetraps, and for such gifts, the payment can be more terrible than you can imagine. Much more terrible than debts and loneliness. Think it over well. Though you've already decided, haven't you? I see it in your eyes. But Michael no longer wanted to think. In his soul, a spark of hope flickered, albeit poisoned by fear and premonition of something wrong, irreversible. He gave the old man his last crumpled bills, stuffed the cold, vibrating box and the scrap of paper into his jacket's inner pocket, and without saying goodbye, almost ran from the shop back into the cold streams of rain. The bell above the door rang mournfully after him, as if counting the last strike before falling into the abyss. Michael almost ran through the dark, wet streets, pressing the box to his chest. It seemed alive and pulsing with cold. He didn't look back. It seemed to him that the old man's colorless eyes were watching his back from the shop's dim window, lost on the edge of his despair and smirking. He had made his decision. Tonight he would try. He would return his life. He would punish David. He would bring back Jessica and Emma. He had to at any cost. Returning to his empty, echoing house, where silence rang in his ears after the noise of rain, Michael first tightly drew the curtains on all windows. Heavy, dusty drapes barely let through the dim light of street lamps, plunging the rooms into heavy, oppressive twilight. He hastily covered the large mirror in the hallway with an old blanket, trying not to look at his reflection, his haggard face with mad eyes. Silence pressed down, broken only by his own intermittent breathing and the distant tapping of rain drops on the windowsill. He took out the box. It still chilled his fingers, but now the vibration had become more distinct, as if something inside was impatiently waiting. Something quietly rustled inside when he shook it. He didn't open it. Primitive fear held him back. Instead, he went to the kitchen. In the refrigerator, pathetically empty after Jessica's departure, he found chicken hearts in vacuum packaging that she'd bought as backup. 7 pieces. Exactly 7. Fate or cruel irony. His heart pounded madly, echoing with hollow beats in his temples as he moved the kitchen table to the center of the living room. He carefully wiped it with a damp cloth, removing invisible specks of dust as if preparing to receive important guests. Then he took out the hearts. Small, reddish, sticky, wet. They looked disgustingly defenseless on the cold tabletop. He arranged them in a circle, trying to do it neatly, almost ritually. The sight and smell of raw flesh made him slightly nauseous, but he suppressed the revulsion. The next step was blood. He took the sharpest knife from the kitchen with a thin blade. He raised it over his left palm, squeezed his eyes shut, and made a quick cut across his thumb pad. Sharp but brief, almost imperceptible against the background of internal tension. A scarlet drop of blood appeared, then another. He brought his bleeding finger to the first heart and let it drip. Then the second, third, 7th. Dark drops spread across the wet surface, mixing with the natural juices like small black seals. The sensation was vile, dirty, and irreversibly wrong. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from strange excitement. Now the words. He took out the crumpled piece of paper. Shadow of night, with blood I call, come 7, fulfill my will. He cleared his throat, trying to calm the tremor in his voice, to gather his courage. The air in the room became thick, heavy, motionless. "Shadow of night, with blood I call, come 7, fulfill my will," he pronounced, trying to speak clearly and commandingly. His voice sounded hoarse and uncertain in the dead silence. He repeated it twice more, louder now, almost shouting the words, putting all his despair, rage, and burning hope into them. Silence, nothing happened. Only the rain started drumming against the window again, as if accompanying his failure. Could the old man just be crazy? Could all this be a stupid, cruel joke, a game of a sick imagination of a desperate man? Michael felt a pang of sharp disappointment mixed with cowardly relief. He was already ready to laugh at his own stupidity. And then he felt the cold. Not a draft, not an unusual drop in temperature, but an icy, otherworldly breath of death that penetrated to his very bones, making the hair on his neck stand on end. The shadows in the corners of the room thickened, became inky black, unnatural. They began to move, flow along the walls and floor, stretching, intertwining, taking shape. 7 figures. They appeared without a single sound, smoothly and inevitably, like clots of black fog. Tall and dark silhouettes wrapped in something like tattered black cloaks or shrouds that hid them completely, not allowing even a guess about the features of bodies underneath. No faces were visible, only deep, viscous, impenetrable darkness under hoods that drew the gaze in. They didn't walk, but hovered a few centimeters above the floor without touching it, frozen in a silent semicircle opposite the table with bloodied hearts. From them came such ancient, inhuman horror and grave cold that Michael almost screamed from primitive fear. He stood paralyzed, unable to move or look away from this nightmarish sight. The silence became absolute, thick, cotton-like. Even the rain drumming outside seemed to have stopped. In this ringing, suffocating, eardrum-vibrating silence, a voice sounded. Rather, not a voice, but a low, vibrating hum that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, being born directly in consciousness. It consisted of many voices, male, female, children's, elderly, whispering, moaning, and croaking in unison, creating a single sepulchral, unbearable sound that made blood freeze in veins and walls tremble. "What do you desire?" The question rolled with an echo through Michael's skull, making every bone vibrate. He convulsively swallowed, trying to moisten his instantly dry throat. "I want to return my business," he exhaled, stammering and choking. "I want my company to work again, for the debts to disappear. I want David to answer for everything, to suffer as much as I have, to lose everything." The figures froze as if listening. For a moment, it seemed to Michael that the darkness under their hoods became even deeper, even more bottomless, as if peering into his soul, weighing his anger. Then came the same multi-voiced, low, vibrating answer that made the table shake and nearly shattered the window glass. "It will be fulfilled." And as suddenly as they appeared, they disappeared, dissolved into shadows, absorbed back into the darkness, leaving behind only the sensation of cold and 7 pitiful, shriveled pieces of flesh on the table. Michael collapsed onto a chair, trembling all over, drenched in cold sweat. He had done it. Had it worked? Was this just a terrifying, realistic nightmare brought on by stress and despair? His phone vibrated in his pocket, making him jump from surprise. He convulsively pulled it out. Unknown number. With apprehension, he pressed the answer button with a trembling finger. "Hello, Michael, Michael Thompson." The voice on the other end was agitated, breaking, female. He recognized her. It was Patricia Williams, their elderly neighbor who had been friends with his parents. "Michael, honey, please don't worry." "Well, rather, oh God, what grief. Your father, Robert, had a heart attack right on the street. He was walking from the store, collapsed. The ambulance came quickly, but they didn't make it in time." Instantly, "I'm so sorry. Your mother doesn't know yet." "I'm afraid to call her." The phone slipped from Michael's weakened fingers and hit the floor with a hollow thud. Father was dead just now. Heart attack. Father had never particularly complained about his heart. He was a strong man, though over 60. This couldn't be a coincidence. The price. The old man had spoken of a price. Could this really be payment for his wish, for his business, for his revenge? Cold sweat poured down his forehead and back. No, this was nonsense. Just a coincidence. Terrible, monstrous, but a coincidence. He was over 60, age, stress. Michael tried to convince himself, but somewhere deep in his soul, an icy worm of all-consuming horror and inevitable guilt stirred. He had killed his own father with his wish. The next few days passed like a delirium. Father's funeral, condolences from relatives and acquaintances, his mother's empty, unseeing eyes as she aged 10 years in one night. Michael tried to hold it together, comfort her, organize everything, but he felt like a disgusting monster, a murderer. Guilt suffocated him, didn't let him sleep, eat, breathe. He barely slept, and when he did fall asleep, he dreamed of dark figures and bloodied hearts mixing with his father's face. But the wish was beginning to come true with frightening speed and precision. First, an investigator called. Not only had criminal charges been filed against David, they'd found him. Not abroad, but in some shabby rented apartment on the outskirts of town, found in a state of complete madness. He sat in a corner, howled, scratched his face, and repeated something incoherent about shadows that had come for him. The money he'd stolen had disappeared. According to rumors, he'd gambled it all away in some underground casino in one night, and then creditors had beaten him up. Doctors diagnosed him with acute psychosis and irreversible brain damage. He was completely crushed, destroyed both morally and physically. Got what he deserved, Michael whispered, but felt no satisfaction, only fear. Then miracles began happening with the business. One of the old major clients that David had stolen appeared, apologized, and offered a new, even more profitable contract. Suddenly, investors appeared ready to invest in restructuring on incredibly favorable terms. Banks made concessions, froze loan interest. The company, recently dead, began rapidly reviving, gaining momentum. Money flowed into accounts again, and what money? Debts began melting away. Everything was returning to normal, even better, richer, more successful than before David's betrayal. But there was no joy. Every piece of good news, every new million in the account resonated in his heart with dull pain and burning guilt over his father's death. He tried to lose himself in work, spending days and nights at the office. But the emptiness in his soul didn't go anywhere, only grew. He even tried to find that antique shop to return the box, throw it away, talk to the old man. But there was no shop in that place, just the blank wall of an old house, as if it had never existed. He returned there several times. Useless. The shop had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. One evening, going through old things in his father's study, he came across his childhood drawing. Him, Mom, and Dad, smiling, happy. Tears flowed from his eyes on their own, and at that moment he understood that business, money, revenge, none of it mattered without family, without Jessica. Without Emma, he had to get them back. But Jessica and Emma were still not by his side. He called Jessica, begged, said that things were getting better, that he had changed, asked her to come back. She was cold and implacable. "It's not just about money, Michael. It's about you. You scare me. You've become a stranger." Loneliness began to flood him again. He looked at Emma's photo, her laughing face with 2 dimples on her cheeks, and it tore his heart. He couldn't live without them. He had to get them back, at any cost. He had already paid one terrible price, so why not risk again? The thought of the box hidden in a locked drawer became more and more obsessive, like an itch under his skin. He drove it away, feared its power, feared new payment, but knew that sooner or later he would take it out again. He tried to throw the box away, threw it from a bridge into the dark river water. The next morning it lay on his pillow, cold and vibrating. Getting rid of it was impossible. And that day came. Again a rainy, damp evening. Again an empty house where every step echoed. Again the ritual. His hands trembled more than the first time. He knew what he was risking, but the image of laughing Emma and the warmth of Jessica's hands overshadowed fear, drowned out the voice of reason and guilt. 7 chicken hearts on the table, arranged in a circle. Again, drops of blood from a cut finger falling on flesh. Words of incantation pronounced in a trembling, breaking voice in thickening darkness. And they came again, silently and inevitably. 7 hovering figures wrapped in shrouds of darkness, emanating in human cold and ancient sorrow. "What do you desire?" "Bring back my family," Michael cried out, and his voice carried tears and pleading. "I want Jessica and Emma to come back to me, for us to be together again, for Jessica to forgive me." A moment of silence that seemed like eternity, filled with silent expectation of judgment. It will be fulfilled. The figures melted into darkness, and Michael stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, listening to the mad beating of his own heart. This time there was no relief at all, only sticky, suffocating fear of inevitable payment. Who was next? Who would they take this time? The phone rang almost immediately, as if waiting for its moment. Michael's heart plummeted somewhere into his heels. Jessica's number. He forced himself to answer. "Michael," her voice was strange, muffled, and tearful. "Michael, Mom is gone. Mom's gone." Stroke right in the kitchen. She fell so suddenly. "I don't know what to do. I have absolutely nowhere to go. Can Emma and I come to you? Please, we have no one else." Michael listened to her, and the world around him collapsed for the second time, finally. Such a predictable and therefore even more monstrous price. He stood holding the receiver, unable to utter a word, and in his ears pulsed only the sepulchral hum. It will be fulfilled. Jessica and Emma returned that same evening. Jessica was completely broken by grief, cried constantly, clung to him, sought support, asked forgiveness for leaving. And he embraced her mechanically, stroked her hair, but felt like a monster who had bought her return with her mother's life. Emma, his sunshine, his angel, was also frightened and confused by her grandmother's death, pressed against him. But there was no longer the former carefree light in her eyes. In them appeared something new, a shadow of fear. A couple of days later, Emma got sick. At first just a fever, light cough. They thought it was a simple cold from stress. But she kept getting worse and worse. The fever wouldn't break. The cough became torturous, dry, barking. The girl weakened, refused food, and barely slept. She often cried and complained that she was scared. Doctors were at a loss. Tests were strange and contradictory. They couldn't make a diagnosis. No medicine helped. The girl was fading before their eyes, turning into a pale shadow. Jessica didn't leave her bedside for a step, haggard, blackened with grief, fear, and sleepless nights. Michael watched his daughter's suffering and his wife's torment, and understood that this too was part of the price, the payment. It hadn't ended with death. It continued, sophisticated and cruel, and now it touched the most precious, most sacred thing he had, his child. At night, when Jessica fell asleep heavily in the chair by Emma's bed, Emma suddenly opened her eyes and whispered in a feverish whisper, "Daddy, there are dark uncles outside the window. There are 7 of them. They wave at me, they're calling me." Michael went cold. He rushed to the window. Outside was only dark, rainy night. No one. But Emma continued to whisper, pointing her little finger into emptiness. The next day, she took crayons and drew a picture. 7 tall black figures, without faces, hovering above the ground. Michael snatched the drawing from her hands and burned it, trembling with horror. That evening, entering his daughter's room, he saw a symbol scratched on the wall above her bed, exactly like the ones on the cursed obsidian box. He locked himself in his study, took the box from the locked drawer. It seemed even colder and heavier than before, and hummed quietly as if mocking him. 2 wishes fulfilled, 2 deaths of loved ones, and his daughter's terrible, inexplicable illness clearly connected to those he had summoned. 2 chances remained, 2 last steps into the abyss. He looked at the black, vibrating surface of the obsidian covered with sinister symbols, and the choice was painfully obvious. He couldn't let Emma die. He couldn't. He had already paid too much to stop now. It was a stuffy, moonless night. The rain had stopped, but heavy clouds swollen with moisture still hung over the city like a wet shroud, promising a new downpour. In the house stood oppressive, viscous silence, broken only by Emma's weak, intermittent, hoarse breathing from the children's room and Jessica's quiet sobs, as she again fell asleep from complete exhaustion right in the chair by their daughter's bed, clutching her hot little hand. Michael sat in the living room, immersed in almost absolute darkness. He had curtained the windows even more tightly. On the table before him again lay 7 chicken hearts, ominously glistening in the darkness like eyes of unknown creatures. His finger was cut on the other hand. The old cut hadn't healed yet. Blood had already dripped onto each heart, absorbed into the flesh. In his hand, he clutched the cursed, worn piece of paper with the incantation. The box lay nearby, emanating quiet cold and barely audible humming. The 3rd time. He knew the price would be terrible. He felt it with every cell of his tortured body. After all the deaths, Emma's terrible illness, her nightmarish visions, he no longer doubted the nature of the forces he summoned. This was a deal with merciless, ancient darkness, and he was dutifully paying the bills with his closest people. But now his daughter's life was at stake. His little Emma, his angel, he couldn't retreat, couldn't let her fade away. He would go to the end. Gathering the remnants of his will, suppressing the groan tearing from his chest, he pronounced the incantation. His voice was hoarse, cracked, almost unrecognizable, full of pain, guilt, and desperate determination. Shadow of night, with blood I call, come 7, fulfill my will. The cold burst into the room even faster, even more fiercely than previous times. It was almost tangible, physically perceptible, like icy needles piercing skin, getting to the bones. 7 dark figures emerged from the darkness instantly, as if they had always been here, just became visible. Their hovering silhouettes seemed even more sinister, dense, and real than before. Silent, heavy expectation hung in the air, thickening it to the limit. "What do you desire?" The low, multi-voiced, unearthly hum hit his ears, resonated with vibration in his chest, made the floor tremble under his feet. "Let my daughter Emma, let her recover." Michael's voice broke into a scream full of agony. "Right now, immediately. Make her healthy. Take away the disease. Leave her alone." He stared into the dark hoods, trying to see at least something, at least a hint of a face. But there was only swirling, living abyss. It seemed to him that the figures swayed slightly forward, as if exchanging silent agreement or anticipating a new victim. "It will be fulfilled." And they disappeared as instantly as they appeared. Michael remained alone in the deafening silence saturated with icy cold. He listened, holding his breath. From the children's room came weak coughing, then another, but already different, not so agonizing, clearing. And then a quiet, uncertain giggle. Michael rushed to the children's room, almost knocking down the door. Jessica had already woken up, alarmed by his cry, and now stood by the bed with wide eyes, not believing what she saw. Emma sat on the bed, pale, very thin after the illness, but her cheeks had slightly pinked, and her eyes were clear, conscious, alive. She looked at the entering Michael and smiled weakly, but completely genuinely, with her own smile. "Daddy," she whispered in a clear, non-hoarse voice. "I feel better, much better. My head doesn't hurt, and it's easy to breathe. I want to eat." Jessica burst into tears, but now these were happy tears of relief and miracle. She rushed to hug her daughter, kiss her forehead, cheeks, hands, whispering words of gratitude to God and doctors. "Emma, my dear, my sunshine, you're getting better. This is a miracle, a real miracle." Michael stood in the doorway, paralyzed by a mixture of boundless joy at the sight of his healthy daughter and soul-freezing, all-consuming premonition. The price. What price this time? Who would pay for this miracle? He looked at Jessica, so happy, so alive, embracing their daughter, and his heart squeezed with unbearable horror. "No, please, no, not her." Jessica raised her radiant, tear-stained but happy face to him. "Michael, do you hear? She's better. Everything's behind us. This is just a miracle. I love you so much." She stood up from the bed, took a step toward him to embrace him, share this joy, and suddenly swayed. Her face contorted in a grimace of surprise and sharp pain. She grabbed her chest where her heart was. Her eyes widened, reflecting not my question and horror of realization. She opened her mouth to say something, call him, but only a quiet, intermittent sigh escaped, and she began to slowly sink to the floor as if cut down. "Jessica," Michael screamed with a wild, inhuman voice, rushing to her. He managed to catch her limp, lifeless body before she fell. Her eyes were wide open, but her gaze was empty, directed nowhere. There was no breathing, no pulse on her neck. "Mommy, Mommy, what's wrong with you?" Emma called fearfully from the bed, starting to cry. But she didn't answer. She was dead. Heart, again the cursed heart. As suddenly, as inevitably as with the others. The third victim, the most terrible, most irreplaceable, his Jessica, his love, his life, the price for his daughter's health. An equivalent exchange, from the point of view of those he had summoned. A week passed after Jessica's funeral. A week of hopeless darkness and automatic actions. Michael mechanically cared for Emma, who had recovered from her illness and was gradually coming to terms with the shock of her mother's death. She was healthy, running around, laughing, drawing. And this was the only tiny, dim firefly in his hopeless darkness. The business was thriving. Money flowed like a river, and partners congratulated him on successful deals. But he didn't care about anything. He had lost the meaning of life, the meaning of everything. He simply existed like an empty shell. He often took out the obsidian box from the locked desk drawer. Now it didn't seem cold. On the contrary, it was warm, almost hot, and the vibration had become constant, strong, as if something inside was impatiently waiting for its moment. 3 wishes had been fulfilled. 3 lives had been paid as a terrible price. The 4th remained, the 4th wish. But what else could he wish for? To bring back Jessica? But at what cost? Emma's death or someone else from the few remaining distant relatives? No, he couldn't pay such a price anymore. He couldn't risk Emma. Never. But he felt with his gut, that this wasn't the end yet. The old man had spoken of 4 wishes, 4 times he could call the entities. He had called them 3 times, but the 4th time, he sensed that the 4th time would be different. That they would come themselves, without summoning, for the final payment. The box in the drawer grew hotter every night. At night, he woke not from cold, but from the sensation of unbearable heat and suffocation in the room. He was alone. Emma slept in her room he had just checked. Michael sat up in bed, his heart pounding madly in his chest, ready to burst out. He knew who had come. The hour of reckoning had arrived. In the darkness of the bedroom, shadows thickened, but now they were not cold but somehow hot, vibrating like heat waves over scorching asphalt. Again 7. They stood in a semicircle at the foot of his bed, silent and motionless, but emanating palpable menace. The darkness under their hoods seemed absolute, absorbing not only light, but the very air. This time they didn't ask what he desired. The air vibrated with their multi-voiced, low, rumbling hum, but the words were different, final, like a sentence. The time has come, the 4th payment. Michael understood everything. The 4th wish wasn't his wish. It was their right to him, his soul. He was the final price for the fulfilled dreams, the final chord in this devilish deal. He himself had concluded this contract with his blood, agreed to the terms, even if not fully understanding their monstrosity. He had received his business back, returned his family, only to lose it again, saved his daughter. But all this was just a prelude to the final act, where he was the main victim. All-consuming horror paralyzed his body, but he didn't scream. What was the point? He looked at the dark figures, and at that moment it seemed to him that in the swirling darkness under the hoods, he saw reflections, distorted by pain and mute reproach, the faces of his father, his mother-in-law, his Jessica. They looked at him from the abyss into which he himself had cast them. Emma, he whispered, the only dear name, thinking of his daughter who would now be completely alone in this terrible world. Hot tears of powerlessness and repentance rolled down his cheeks. The figures slowly moved toward him, hovering above the floor, filling all space. Their invisible but tangible hands reached for him from the shadows. The heat became unbearable, the air thickened, making breathing impossible. He saw darkness enveloping him, the world narrowing to these 7 faceless silhouettes and reflections of beloved faces in the abysses. His last thought was not a plea for mercy, but bitter, belated realization. He had wanted to return his life, but in pursuit of it, he had destroyed everything, and given for the illusion of happiness much more than he had. He had lost this game with darkness on all counts, and now it was time to pay the final bill. "You are ours." The multi-voiced hum absorbed his consciousness. Darkness closed in, dragging his soul into its bottomless maw. The empty apartment, where the smell of fear still lingered. Only a hot obsidian box remained on the nightstand, quietly vibrating in anticipation, and a little girl sleeping soundly in the next room, not knowing that she had just become a complete orphan, and that deep in this box, perhaps, new wishes were already waiting for the next desperate fool who would wander into a shop on the edge of despair. It seems to me that the main character really acted foolishly. He should have done everything with his own forces, as they say, tried to cope with it himself somehow. And once again, we are convinced that you shouldn't resort to dark forces because they will take everything and deceive you. And if you listen to the story to the very end, put an angry little devil emoji, so we'll know how many of us listened to the story to the very end. And I, as always, don't say goodbye to you, because we'll hear each other in the next terrifyingly interesting story. Author Michael Rivers. The fuel gauge hit empty at the worst possible moment. To make matters worse, the engine started making that grinding noise that meant expensive repairs. Jake Collins had no choice but to pull over on the shoulder of the dark highway. Outside, a cold rain was falling steadily, turning the October night into a miserable soup of darkness and dampness. The sky was black as tar, and Jake cursed under his breath as he climbed out of his 18-wheeler and walked around to check the engine. He popped the hood and immediately saw the problem: a busted radiator hose and no spare coolant. "Just my damn luck," he muttered, slamming the hood shut hard enough to make the whole truck shake. Jake looked around. To his left stretched endless cornfields, their brown stalks rustling in the wind. To his right, a thick forest of pine and oak trees disappeared into the darkness. On a crooked, weather-beaten signpost, he could barely make out the faded letters: "Pine Ridge Motel vacancy, 2 miles ahead." Relief washed over Jake. At least he wouldn't have to spend the night in his cab, waiting for a tow truck that might not come until morning. His cell phone showed no signal out here in the middle of nowhere, so calling for help wasn't an option anyway. Jake grabbed his jacket and a flashlight from the truck, locked up, and started walking down the narrow gravel road that led into the forest. The path was barely wide enough for a car, rutted with potholes and slick with mud from the rain. As he walked deeper into the woods, the wind picked up, making the trees creak and groan around him. The sound sent chills down his spine. The deeper he went, the colder it seemed to get. The rain kept falling, soaking through his jacket and running down his neck. Jake used his phone's flashlight to see the path ahead, but the weak beam barely cut through the thick darkness surrounding him. After what felt like forever, he noticed the trees were starting to look different, bare and lifeless, like something had sucked all the life out of them. The leaves on the ground were brown and rotting, giving off a smell like death and decay. How much further can this place be? Jake grumbled to himself, his boots squelching through muddy puddles. Water had soaked through to his socks, and his pants were splattered with mud up to his knees. Then he looked up and saw it. Ahead on a small hill stood a 2-story building that looked like it hadn't seen better days in decades. A flickering neon sign buzzed and sparked above the entrance. the words Pine Ridge Motel, barely visible through the cracked plastic. Half the letters were burned out, making it read, P-N-R-D-G-E-M-Tel. Jake picked up his pace, almost jogging now. But as he got closer, his excitement turned to disappointment. The place was clearly abandoned. The white paint was peeling off the walls in long strips. The windows were either boarded up or broken, and weeds had grown up through cracks in the parking lot. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. "Son of a bitch," Jake said, kicking at a chunk of broken concrete. He stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do next. Then he noticed something that made him look twice. Further up the hill, maybe a quarter-mile away, stood a large Victorian house with a round tower on one side. Most of the windows were dark, but there was a warm yellow light glowing in one of the tower windows. Jake felt a spark of hope. People in small towns were usually friendly and helpful. Maybe whoever lived there would let him use their phone, or at least give him a place to wait out the storm until morning. He trudged up the muddy path toward the house, trying to stay positive. The house was surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had seen better days. Rust covered most of the metal, and several of the decorative spikes were broken or missing. The house itself looked old but sturdy, with dark wooden siding and a wraparound porch. All the shutters were closed, except for that one lit window in the tower. The place had an unsettling feel to it, like it was watching him as he approached. Jake climbed the creaky porch steps and knocked on the front door. The sound echoed inside like he was knocking on the door of a cathedral. After a moment, he heard slow footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened with a squeal of rusty hinges that made Jake wince. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman holding a candle. She was wrapped in a faded quilted robe, and deep shadows fell across her weathered face. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes looked cloudy and unfocused. "Who's there?" she asked in a raspy voice, leaning forward slightly. Jake took a small step back. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am. I'm Jake Collins. My truck broke down on the highway, and I was hoping I could use your phone to call for help. I'm soaked to the bone out here." The old woman tilted her head, studying him with those strange, milky eyes. "A traveler," she said slowly, "lost and far from home. Come in, come in." Jake hesitated for a second, then stepped inside. The woman closed the door behind him and slid a heavy bolt into place. The sound made Jake's stomach clench, but he told himself she was just being careful. An old woman living alone in the middle of nowhere had to be cautious. She led him down a dark hallway, the candle casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jake's eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, but he could make out the shapes of old furniture and picture frames lining the corridor. The woman brought him to a round room with a spiral staircase in one corner leading up to the tower. In the center stood a round table covered with a white lace tablecloth that had yellowed with age. Around it were 6 wooden chairs with faded red cushions and carved rose designs on their backs. "Sit," the woman said, setting the candle on the table. Jake pulled out a chair and sat down, glancing around the room. Old kitchen cabinets lined the walls, and a leather sofa sat in one corner, its surface cracked and worn. An old stone fireplace dominated the wall opposite the kitchen area. The woman shuffled over to the fireplace, her arms full of kindling and logs. Jake watched as she skillfully built a fire and lit it with a match. The flames crackled to life, filling the room with warm light and chasing away some of the chill. She returned to the kitchen area and came back with a tray holding an ornate silver tea service, a large pot, and 2 delicate china cups. She poured tea for both of them and sat down across from Jake. "Thank you kindly, ma'am," Jake said, taking a sip. The tea was strong and bitter, barely warm. "I don't suppose you have a phone I could use. I need to call for a tow truck." Silence stretched between them. The woman stared at him with those cloudy eyes for a long moment, then suddenly burst into loud, harsh laughter that made Jake's skin crawl. "What's so funny?" he asked, setting down his cup. "Until the rooster crows at dawn, you're trapped here," she said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality. "And if you want to leave this place alive, you'll have to work through the night doing good deeds." Jake forced a laugh. "Come on, lady. You're trying to scare me. I'm not afraid of some old stories." "Do you want to go home?" she asked, leaning forward. "Or do you plan to stay here forever? What are you getting at? What do you want from me?" The woman's expression grew serious. "There's an ancient curse on this land. You'll need to lift it if you want to leave here alive and keep your sanity intact." Jake started to object, but the woman held up her hand. "3 tasks you must complete before dawn," she continued. 3 dark and terrible deeds. Only then will you be free." A cold shiver ran down Jake's spine, like someone had dragged an ice cube along his backbone. The room suddenly felt colder, as if the fire had gone out, though the flames still danced in the fireplace. "What kind of tasks?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "First, you must properly bury my bones. Dig them up from where they lie and move them to the cemetery. Give them a proper burial so my restless soul can find peace." Jake noticed his hands were shaking as he lifted his teacup. "Second task, drive the demons from this house. But to do that, you'll need a Bible and a cross. They're hidden in the old chapel that stands beyond the cemetery." Jake couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Her milky, unseeing eyes seemed to bore into his soul, hypnotizing him. "And the third task," he managed to ask. "After you've waited for the rooster's crow at dawn, you must kill me and send me to the light. Cut off my head and burn my body." "Why would you ask me to do that?" "I put a curse on this land years ago. I cursed everyone I loved, and the curse turned back on me, trapping me in this house and taking away my sight. Only someone with a pure and sinless soul can break it. You'll free both of us with this act." Jake swallowed hard. "I'll do what you ask. Where are your bones buried?" "On the hill under the dead tree, where the lost girl hangs from a rope. My sister lies beneath her." The old woman turned to look at an antique clock on the mantel. Its golden pendulum chimed midnight. "Hurry, you must finish before the rooster crows. If you don't, you'll be trapped here forever, living with me for all eternity." The woman let out another chilling laugh that seemed to freeze the blood in Jake's veins. With a heavy heart and ice-cold fear gripping his soul, Jake left the house that had seemed like a safe haven just moments before. Standing on the porch, Jake thought about the shovel he'd need to dig up the bones. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach, but he didn't dare go back and ask the woman for one. He'd have to figure it out as he went. Walking up the hill behind the house, Jake surveyed the landscape. The sickly forest covered the rolling hills, and a layer of dead leaves crunched under his feet. About 100 yards from the house, he spotted a massive oak tree standing alone on the hilltop. At its base, old headstones and crosses stuck up from the ground at odd angles. But what caught his attention most was the rope hanging from one of the thick branches, with a woman's body swaying gently in the night breeze. "Well, I've come this far," Jake muttered to himself. "Might as well see it through." The moon had come out from behind the clouds, casting an eerie silver light through the trees. The pale glow helped him see the path, but it also made everything look ghostly and unreal. Jake walked carefully, looking around nervously. A superstitious dread had settled in his chest, sending tiny needles of fear into his soul. Dead leaves rustled under his feet, and fog was starting to rise from the ground. His breath came out in visible puffs in the cold air. In all his years as a truck driver, Jake had seen a lot of strange things on lonely highways, but he'd never encountered anything like this. He'd hoped to spend a quiet night in a motel room, maybe watch some TV and get a good night's sleep. Instead, he'd stumbled into what felt like his worst nightmare. His thoughts were interrupted by the harsh cawing of crows. Jake looked up to see the enormous oak tree looming above him. Its trunk was massive and black, with thick, twisted branches that had once held a full canopy of leaves. Now, instead of leaves, one of the branches displayed something far more disturbing. The wind, carrying the scent of rotting leaves and approaching winter, whipped at the remains of what had once been a white dress. Now it looked more like a tattered shroud, torn and stained with mud and decay. The body hung with its feet pointing down, the neck twisted at an unnatural angle from the rope. The girl's long black hair hung loose around her face like a dark curtain, contrasting sharply with the pale, torn fabric. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, and Jake could see the dark network of veins beneath the surface. Her lips were black, frozen in what looked like a final, bitter smile. Directly below the hanging body, a shovel stuck up from the ground. So this was where the old woman's bones were buried. Jake whispered a quick prayer and got to work. The ground was hard and frozen, making every shovelful a struggle. Jake worked up a cold sweat as he dug, constantly aware of the shadow cast by the hanging girl above him. The deeper he dug, the harder the work became. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. Jake's spirits lifted slightly. He was almost done with the first task. He dug with renewed energy, clearing away the last of the dirt. At the bottom of the hole lay yellowed, worm-eaten bones, a cracked skull, a rib cage, shoulder blades, and arm bones. Jake straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, and took a deep breath. That's when he realized the shadow of the hanging girl had disappeared. Jake could only see his own shadow on the ground. Slowly, he turned around. The hanging girl was standing just a few feet away from him. When their eyes met, she reached out toward him with skeletal hands. Ice-cold fingers wrapped around his throat as the corpse knocked him to the ground and climbed on top of him. Her eyes were like glass marbles, colorless and empty, set in black sockets. Her black lips parted to reveal sharp, broken teeth. "What delicious fear," she hissed, tightening her grip on his throat. The smell of death and decay washed over him as she leaned closer. Her gray tongue lolled out, dripping with foul-smelling saliva. But Jake wasn't easy prey. He was a former police detective and had dealt with plenty of dangerous situations. Adrenaline surged through his system as he fought back. He grabbed the corpse's wrists and shoved her away from him, then rolled to the side as she fell. Jumping to his feet, Jake grabbed the shovel and swung it like a baseball bat, striking the creature in the chest. Her ribs cracked with a sickening sound, her dress tore, and black blood sprayed across the ground. Jake raised the shovel again, this time aiming for her stomach. On the third swing, he separated her head from her broken neck. Jake quickly stripped the tattered dress from the corpse's twisted, half-decayed body, wrapped the bones from the grave in the fabric, and headed for the cemetery, taking the shovel with him. The cemetery was just down the hill. Jake found himself standing among crooked wooden crosses and moss-covered headstones. He found an empty spot near a lone pine tree and got to work. The ground here was softer and easier to dig, so the job didn't take long. When he finished, Jake opened the makeshift shroud and let the old woman's bones tumble into the fresh grave. They landed in a neat pile at the bottom. "Rest in peace," Jake whispered, making the sign of the cross. "I hope you find the peace you're looking for." He stood there for a moment, then started shoveling dirt back into the hole. When the grave was filled, Jake turned around and witnessed something truly amazing. The oak tree on the hill had come back to life. Its trunk had returned to a healthy brown color, and full green leaves had sprouted on all its branches. Even the forest around the cemetery had transformed. The dead, twisted trees had straightened up and grown new foliage. Jake smiled. It seemed like his actions had lifted part of the curse from the land, bringing it back to life before his very eyes. One task down, 2 to go. Now he needed to find the chapel and get the Bible and cross to drive the demons from the old woman's house. Jake started walking, hoping to finish quickly so he could get out of this nightmare and go home. But that was probably just wishful thinking. Still, a man had to hope for something, or life wasn't worth living. At the edge of the cemetery, Jake came to a crossroads with a wooden signpost in the center. Crude wooden arrows pointed in different directions. The sign pointing right read, "Beware the water spirit." The sign pointing left read, "Seek forgiveness before the Lord and cleanse your soul of sin." Jake went left. The path led through dense woods, then suddenly climbed upward and emerged onto another hilltop. There stood a small wooden chapel that looked like something from a frontier town. The boards had weathered to a silver-gray color, and golden crosses on the roof gleamed in the moonlight against the clear night sky. Jake quickened his pace. The closer he got, the larger the chapel seemed to become, while he felt like he was shrinking. Finally reaching the entrance, he ran up the steps and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The wind from outside nearly extinguished the candles that flickered in the darkest corners of the small church. About 20 feet from the entrance stood a wooden altar decorated with bronze fittings. Across from it, on a lectern, sat a leather-bound Bible. On its cover rested a golden crucifix. There was what he needed to drive the demons from the old woman's house. Jake quickly crossed the chapel, slowed his pace near the lectern, reached out, took the Bible, tucked it under his arm, gripped the cross in his fist, and turned around. Blocking his path stood a priest in black robes, enormous, at least 8 feet tall. Over his thick gray beard that reached his stomach gleamed a silver crucifix studded with emeralds. He clenched his massive fists, which looked like sledgehammers. His face was white as death, his eyes black and filled with rage. "This is sacrilege," the priest boomed in a voice like thunder. "You dare touch these sacred relics, you godless heathen. The Lord will punish you for your sins." The priest grabbed Jake by the shirt collar and lifted him off the floor. "Now you'll know God's wrath, blasphemer." With those words, the priest hurled Jake across the chapel. "Repent," he bellowed. Jake hit the floor hard, rolled from his stomach to his back, and propped himself up on his elbows. The priest was walking toward him with heavy steps that shook the floor. "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven," the priest muttered under his breath. His eyes flashed with lightning, his pale face frozen in hatred and fury. The chapel walls seemed to pulse and sway. The floor trembled under the priest's weight. Jake jumped up, spotted the Bible and cross lying in the aisle where the priest was now standing, and made a desperate decision. "Repent," the priest commanded. Jake ran straight at the priest, dove between his legs, and slid along the floor, grabbing the Bible and cross as he went. Straightening up with the Bible under his arm and the cross in his hand, Jake backed away until he hit the altar. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," the priest continued. "For thine is the kingdom, and the power and the glory of the Father and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and forever, and unto ages of ages. Amen." The massive figure blocked the doorway. Jake kept his eyes fixed on him. "Repent or burn in hell, pray, you godless man." Fighting would be suicide. The priest could easily break his neck and tear him apart. Jake had no chance in a direct confrontation. He had to use cunning and quick thinking. Without hesitation, Jake ran toward a window. The priest followed. Jake jumped, smashed through the glass and wooden frame that were barely holding together, and soon landed on the cold ground and dry grass. Rolling from his chest to his back, Jake got to his feet. The priest had managed to stick only his head through the opening. "The Lord will punish you, sinner. Repent while there's still time," the priest shouted, trying to squeeze his head through the window frame. "Go to hell," Jake replied. With that, he hurled the shovel like a spear, hitting the priest square in the open mouth with the blade. The priest's face contorted as he made gurgling, incoherent sounds, blood filling his throat, then disappeared back into the chapel. Jake grinned and walked away. Now he had to complete the second task, drive the demons from the old woman's house. When he got back to the house, the old woman was nowhere to be found. The front door stood open. Following his memory, he made his way through the hallway to the central room where they'd had their conversation. Jake placed the Bible on the table next to the cross. The fire in the fireplace had almost died out. Only the last few logs were burning, sending up occasional sparks. "Hey, is anyone home?" he called out loudly. His voice echoed off the old walls but didn't carry beyond the living room. The house seemed to resist his presence, as if it didn't want to hear him. It seemed like the concentration of dark energy and demonic souls was fighting back. Time to begin the exorcism. Jake picked up the Bible and opened it. The smell of old, dry paper and centuries of dust filled his nostrils. The pages had stuck together and hardened like thin tree bark. Jake lifted the crucifix from the table, and suddenly it was as if some spirit had taken control of his body. His lips began to move, and his voice started whispering a prayer that Jake had never known before. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We put on the armor of Christ and the Word of God. Fear the devil and depart from God's servant. Christ is risen, and by his will and power I cast you out, terrible and unclean devil, by the power of God the Father invisible." After these words, a fierce, bone-chilling wind swept through the house, extinguishing the fireplace and all the candles. Complete darkness fell. The furniture in the room began to jump and rattle, dishes clattered, and Jake heard a door creaking open somewhere. Christ was buried, Christ is risen. I conquer in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit forever and ever. Amen. The cross is upon me, God's servant. I curse and cast out the devil with the cross, Jake continued. His voice grew louder and more unrecognizable. His legs carried him into the hallway. Depart, demons and devils and unclean spirits from me, God's servant. Depart from the one in whom you dwell, from God's servant. Go away from these doors. Here sit angels and archangels, cherubim and seraphim. Jake walked down the hallway. A bitter cold filled the house. The door slammed shut behind him with tremendous force. Steam poured from Jake's mouth. Here are the archangels Michael and Gabriel. The most holy Virgin Mary, ever Virgin Mother of God, Queen of Heaven, who gave birth to the Creator in flesh. Jesus Christ our God, King of Heaven. After crossing the long, dark corridor, Jake turned a corner. The strange, booming voice continued to preach through the man's lips. By the body of Christ be cursed, devil, unclean spirit, by all seven councils, now and forever, unto ages of ages. Amen. The cross is the guardian of the whole universe. The cross is the beauty of the church. The cross is the strength of kings. The cross drives away devils from God's servant. Jake began climbing the stairs. The temperature in the house had dropped to something comparable to a harsh winter, when bitter frost turns the world into an icy palace. Frost formed on the walls and doors. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, Jake had already reached the second floor. Amen. The Bible slammed shut. Jake exhaled, feeling as if a huge, cold needle had been pulled from his chest. It was like the feeling after an injection, when the doctor inserts the necessary medicine through a syringe, then dabs the wound with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball and withdraws the needle. Only now it felt twice as strong and more painful. Jake's legs gave out and he dropped to his knees. Meanwhile, the house had grown warmer. Even the lights slowly began to come on, which had been impossible to imagine before. Obviously, the evil spirit had been cast out and the house was free, which meant it had come alive. With a crackle, Soviet-era chandeliers lit up, flooding the narrow, long second-floor corridor with dim light. Doors lined the hallway, and the walls were decorated with black and white photographs in frames, dated from the early 1900s. Jake stood up. "I've done what you asked," he whispered into the emptiness, addressing the old woman in his mind. One task remained. In response, a door at the far end of the corridor slowly opened, brightly lit by wall-mounted candles. "You there, old woman?" His voice grew stronger and louder. The door drew closer, the corridor seeming to widen as he approached. Jake stopped at the threshold and hesitated briefly. Then the door swung open inward, inviting the guest and revealing what it had been hiding. In a rocking chair, facing a curtained window, someone was sitting. Jake could see the top of a head. He had no doubt it was the old woman. Crossing the threshold, Jake walked past a bed on the left and a bookshelf on the right, noticing how the door closed behind him. He was drawn to the chair as if by a magnet. "All right, enough games," he said. He put his hand on the back of the chair and turned it around. A skeleton in the old woman's dress grinned at him. The bony skull had fallen to one side, and a worm crawled out of an eye socket and disappeared under the dress worn by the corpse. Jake shuddered as if ice-cold fingers had tickled his spine. He stepped back and bumped into a woman's chest. He turned around to see the old woman standing before him, but he didn't notice the most important thing. The blind woman was holding a kitchen knife. "This is for my sister," she said. The cold blade pierced his soft flesh, entering Jake's side. He met the glassy eyes of the witch, who had stepped close to him after the strike. She pulled out the knife and plunged it again, this time into his stomach. Jake's legs turned to jelly and barely held him up, but he found the strength to fight back. He pushed the old woman away and head-butted her in the forehead. She laughed and ran out into the corridor. Jake held his hand to the wound. His fingers trembled, his whole hand sticky with blood. This witch would pay. He was getting out of here. Since it had come to this, Jake noticed a double-barreled shotgun hanging above the headboard of the bed. The steel barrel gleamed. First his engine had died and he'd run out of gas. Then, hoping for help, he'd ended up in this house. Then all the horror had begun, and now, having gotten used to the fear and swallowed it like a bitter pill, Jake firmly decided that no matter what, he was getting out of here and going home. Grabbing the shotgun from the wall, Jake forgot about his wound and went looking for the old woman. He'd managed to defeat the corpse at the oak tree and outwit the possessed priest in the chapel. He'd handle this blind witch with a knife too, one way or another. Jake left the bedroom, holding the shotgun ready, prepared to blow the witch's head off at any moment. He moved slowly down the corridor, his boots creaking on the floor, listening to the silence. Through the walls, he could hear the steady rain, and overhead, drops drummed on the roof. The chandeliers flickered and blinked. The corridor alternately grew light and dark. When Jake reached the staircase, a quiet, creaky, mocking laugh drifted up from the first floor. Jake jumped, nearly pulling the trigger. The witch was hiding somewhere downstairs. Jake hurried down the stairs. On the first floor, he paused in the entryway, trying to catch every rustle and sound. From the right came another chuckle, this time louder and clearer. At that moment, the blind woman appeared behind Jake, whose nerves were already being tested to their limits. The knife gleamed in her hand, but a miracle saved Jake's life. Or maybe luck, though luck is a myth. He turned his head slightly and caught sight of the blade out of the corner of his eye. Jake spun around quickly and struck the old woman with the shotgun butt. The witch staggered and stepped back, lowering her head and looking at the floor. Jake looked down too. Golden teeth lay scattered there. The old woman raised her head, and Jake pulled the trigger. A fountain of blood, brain matter, and gore exploded where the witch's head had been, covering him from head to toe. The next moment, a headless body stood in front of Jake. Jake was about to celebrate, but it was premature. "Don't celebrate too soon, hero," he thought. Even though the witch had lost her head, her body continued to fight. She swung her arm and slashed with the knife across his shoulder. Jake swore and stepped back. The headless body skillfully swung the knife blindly in front of her and came at him. "Begone, evil spirit," Jake crossed himself and fired again. This time the shotgun powerfully and satisfyingly blew off her left arm. But the undead creature didn't give up. Another swing of the knife, another strike. A thin line appeared on Jake's cheek, and his face burned with heat and pain. He backed up until his shoulder hit the doorframe. Reloading the shotgun, Jake blew off the witch's legs. And now only a torso with one arm writhed a few steps away from him. Then Jake decided to finish her off. The shotgun kept firing until nothing was left of the witch. Well, nothing was left except for a wet spot, and that wet spot was in Jake's pants. The lights in the house stopped flickering, and the chandeliers worked at full power. The wallpaper changed from peeling and cracked to clean and smooth, as if after renovation. The floors no longer creaked. And when Jake went outside, the house was unrecognizable. The place looked like new. So the curse had been completely lifted from this land, and the forest around the house had also come alive, becoming green and lush. Somewhere nearby, a train passed with a familiar whistle. After it, a rooster crowed. Was this a dream, or was he living a nightmare? Was this reality, or had he imagined it all? Well, it didn't matter. It was all over, and he'd be home soon. Jake emerged from the woods to find a train platform with a glass and metal canopy. There was no train yet, but a man was shifting from foot to foot on the platform. Jake climbed onto the platform and approached the edge, glancing at the stranger. He was tall, wearing a long gray coat and hat with glasses. He held a leather briefcase in his hand. Under his coat, Jake could see a red and white track suit and a shirt. The stranger smiled at Jake, but their conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a train. Both men silently boarded the car and sat across from each other. The man in glasses kept staring at Jake, smiling slyly and stroking his leather briefcase. Jake turned away and leaned his head back against the seat, finally allowing himself to relax. "What a night," he yawned and mumbled. "Nobody would believe it if I told them." "They'll believe it at the police station," the man in the coat chuckled. "Time to confess." Jake recognized the priest's voice. He slowly lifted his head from the headrest and looked around. To the right of the mysterious stranger sat the priest, his head touching the ceiling of the car. Jake's seatmate turned out to be the girl from the oak tree. She sat naked, without her dress, stroking her sagging, bluish breasts and smiling lustfully with her black mouth. The man in glasses and hat opened his briefcase. Jake saw a kitchen knife wrapped in a kitchen towel in his hands. "Repent," said the priest. All three of them lunged at Jake, who was pressed back in his seat. Well, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately our main character apparently didn't make it in time, or simply did something wrong. He couldn't escape the old woman's clutches. If you listen to the story all the way to the end, give it a like. That way we'll know how many of you heard it through to the very end. And as always, I'm not saying goodbye, because we'll hear each other again in the next terrifyingly interesting story. The wet asphalt gleamed under the dim light of the only surviving street lamp, like scales on some ancient fish. I trudged along, head down, trying to shield my face from the fine, nasty drizzle that had been falling since yesterday, and showed no signs of stopping. In my pocket, the last of my change jingled pathetically, just enough for a pack of the cheapest cigarettes and maybe a cup of instant coffee from the vending machine. The prospects were, to put it mildly, pretty grim. Finals were coming up. I had a tail of assignments longer than a stray dog has fleas, and Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment downstairs had already hinted twice that her patience wasn't unlimited, meaning, of course, her patience about my overdue rent. It was in exactly this kind of mood, perfectly suited for philosophical reflections on the bleakness of existence, that I stumbled over something hard, nearly sprawling face first into a puddle. I cursed under my breath and was about to kick Whatever invisible obstacle had tripped me. But something made me take a closer look. On the dirty asphalt, almost right at the curb, lay a cell phone. Just an ordinary black rectangle, nothing fancy. The screen was dark. I picked it up. The case was cold and smooth, without a single scratch, strange for something lying in the street. No identifying marks, no logos. I tried to turn it on. No response. Dead, probably, or just out of battery. My first thought was to take it to the nearest police station, or at least try to find the owner. But then another, more pragmatic thought woke up. What if the owner calls, and I, being such an honest and decent person, return their lost property for a modest reward? A sum large enough to at least cover the rent formed very temptingly in my imagination. Yeah, I know, not very noble, but as they say, desperate times call for desperate measures. I shoved the phone into my jacket pocket and hurried home to my den on the outskirts of the city. At home, I first tried to find some kind of charging port or SIM card slot on the phone. Useless. The case was solid, smooth as a river stone. No volume buttons, no ports, just one inconspicuous button on the side, apparently for power, and that was it. Old device, maybe some Chinese knockoff or experimental prototype. I put it on the table and stared at it like a sheep at a new gate. What to do with it? Wait for a call. But how would anyone call it if it's turned off? Maybe it doesn't even have a SIM card. What nonsense. I pressed the power button again, this time holding it longer. And then, miracle of miracles, the screen lit up. A bright flash, and then an image appeared on it, a stylized spiral slowly rotating on a black background. No PIN code requests, no carrier menus, just this spiral, and below it a single inscription. Echo. Echo? What kind of echo? I tapped the screen with my finger. The spiral stopped, and then a text message appeared on the display, typed in simple white font. New order available. Accept. Decline. Below were 2 virtual buttons with the corresponding labels. I was stunned. What order? What the hell kind of order? Is this some kind of game or virus? I looked at the phone warily. Maybe I should just throw it away to be safe. But curiosity, multiplied by desperate financial circumstances, did its work. What if this is some new kind of earning opportunity? Like real-world quests or something like that. I'd heard of such things. My hand reached for the accept button by itself. I had nothing to lose anyway, except my last pair of pants. As soon as I pressed accept, the text on the screen changed. Now there was something like instructions. Order number 1. Item, 1 standard pack of copy paper, format 8.5 by 11 inches, white, 20-pound weight, minimum 500 sheets. Package unopened. Destination, door number 7, building number 2, Maple Street, house number 43. Deliver between 11 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. Recipient, entity archivist. Payment, determined upon completion. Note, maintain silence. Do not initiate contact unless necessary. I read this several times. Copy paper, Maple Street 43. That's the abandoned house on the other side of town. Nobody's lived there for 10 years. What the hell kind of archivist? What does entity mean? This is a prank. A very stupid and unfunny prank. But at the bottom of the screen, I noticed another detail. A battery charge indicator. It showed 90%, and next to it, a small hourglass icon and a timer counting down time. 24 hours, apparently, to complete the order. I looked at my empty pockets again. A pack of paper costs pennies. Even if this is someone's idiotic prank, I'm not losing anything. And if they actually pay something for it, decision made, I'm going. Buying the paper turned out to be easy. The nearest office supply store was still open. I spent almost my last money. Getting to Maple Street 43 took the last bus, and then I had to walk for about 20 minutes through some gloomy wasteland. The house looked exactly as an abandoned building should. Broken windows, peeling plaster, thick weeds growing all around. Building number 2 greeted me with the smell of dampness, mold, and cat urine. Door number 7 was shabby wood with remnants of paint of some indeterminate color. I looked at the time on the found phone, 11:05 p.m. Time had come. My heart was pounding like crazy. I felt like a complete idiot. What am I doing here? Why do I need all this? The phone in my hand vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. Portal activated. Door number 7, be careful. I took a deep breath and grabbed the door handle. It gave way with a quiet creak. I peeked inside and froze. Behind the door was not an ordinary apartment. There was nothing there that resembled human habitation. It was a huge, almost infinite space filled with shelving units. The shelves stretched as far as the eye could see, both in height and width, disappearing somewhere in the gloom. The shelves were piled with countless folders, scrolls, books, and various boxes. The air was dry, smelling of old paper and dust, and the silence dead, absolute silence. I stepped inside. The door closed quietly behind me, cutting me off from the familiar world. I became truly frightened. Where did I end up? What is this place? Maintain silence. The instruction from the phone surfaced in my memory. I tried to move as quietly as possible, but my footsteps echoed hollowly in this enormous hall. And then I saw him, or her. It was sitting behind a huge desk piled with papers at the far end of one of the passages between the shelves. Tall, thin, with disproportionately long arms and fingers. I couldn't see its face. It was hidden under the deep hood of a dark robe. The creature was quickly writing something in a huge book with a quill pen. The archivist, I guessed. I slowly approached, clutching the pack of paper in my hand. The creature paid no attention to me, completely absorbed in its work. Hello, I mumbled. My voice sounded hoarse and uncertain. The creature froze, slowly raised its head. From under the hood, 2 small red lights looked at me, not eyes, but exactly lights. Order arrived, came a quiet, rustling voice, like the sound of dry leaves. The voice sounded not from outside, but as if directly in my head. Yes, I said, extending the pack of paper. The creature stretched out its long, bony hand with thin, needle-like fingers, took the paper, and for some time examined it, turning it over as if weighing it. Then it nodded. Accepted, meets specifications. It placed the pack on the table, bent over its book again, and quickly wrote something in it. Payment over there, it said, waving its hand toward one of the shelves. I looked there. On one of the shelves, among thick folio volumes, lay a small bag of dark fabric. Thank you, I said, and hurried to the shelf. In the bag were money, several large bills. I quickly counted. The sum was more than decent, 3 times what I paid for my hole. I couldn't believe my eyes. This actually works. The phone in my pocket vibrated again. Order number 1 completed. Payment received. Exit is where entrance was. Portal will be active for 10 more minutes. I turned around. The archivist was again absorbed in his work, paying no attention to me. I backed toward where I thought the door was, And indeed, it was there, an ordinary shabby door leading back to the dark, stinking hallway. I burst outside like I'd been scalded. My heart was still pounding. I stood on the landing, breathing heavily, trying to comprehend what had just happened. It wasn't a dream. The money in my pocket was real. And that place, those shelves, that archivist. I looked at the phone. The battery indicator showed 100%. The charge had been restored, and the timer was counting down 24 hours again. All the way home, I was in a daze. On one hand, fear and bewilderment. On the other, euphoria from easy money. I decided not to tell anyone anything for now, not Emily, my girlfriend, not my best friend Mike. They simply wouldn't believe me or would think I'd lost my mind. The next day I spent on pins and needles. The phone lay on the table and I kept glancing at it. Exactly at midnight it vibrated. New order available. Accept. Decline. I pressed accept without hesitation. Order number 2 was even stranger. Item: 3 live earthworms, each at least 2 inches long. Place in glass jar with small amount of moist soil. Destination: hollow of old oak tree, Central Park, Sector G. Leave between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. Recipient: Root Walker. Payment determined upon completion. Note: no noise. Do not use artificial light. Earthworms, old oak in the park. Root Walker. The madness was getting stronger, but the sum received for the previous order warmed my heart and pocket. Digging up worms after rain turned out to be easy. The park at night looked creepy. I found the right oak tree, guided by a crudely drawn map that appeared on the phone screen. The hollow was large and dark. I left the jar with worms there and quickly retreated. A few minutes later, the phone reported that the order was completed. As payment, an amount twice the previous one appeared on my bank card, a number I'd never specified anywhere, but the phone apparently somehow knew it. I was shocked and delighted. This is a gold mine. Strange, yes. A little scary, yes. But the money is real, big money. I'll be able to pay off my debts, buy normal clothes, take Emily to a decent restaurant. Life is looking up. That's how my new job began. Every day the phone gave me a new order. The items were the strangest. Sometimes 3 feathers from a gray crow's tail. Sometimes a small bottle of morning dew collected from a specific flower. Sometimes a handful of soil from a cemetery. This last order I completed with particular shuddering. The destinations were equally unexpected. Abandoned construction sites, basements of old houses, remote forest paths, even the city sewers. The recipients were no less colorful. Whisperer, a shapeless creature of shadows living in an abandoned movie theater. Eye crawler, something like a giant spider with multiple faceted eyes living under the old bridge. Echo collector, a humanoid figure in a long cloak who met me on deserted night streets and took items that made quiet sounds, like old clocks or music boxes. Each time crossing the threshold of another portal, I experienced a mixture of fear and excitement. The worlds behind the doors were incredible, phantasmagorical, sometimes frighteningly beautiful, like that world where the sky was purple and trees grew with roots upward, and jellyfish-like glowing creatures floated in the air. Sometimes openly creepy, like labyrinths of rusty metal where rustling and someone's heavy breathing could be heard around every corner. And the walls oozed some sticky, dark slime. I tried not to think about who these creatures were and why they needed all these strange items. I just did my job and got paid, and the payments became more and more generous. I bought new clothes, a good smartphone, the old ordinary one I now used only for calls, and started saving money. Emily and Mike, of course, noticed the changes. "Jason, where are you getting all this cash?" Mike asked one day when we were sitting in a bar. Now I could afford it. "You dealing or something?" "Yeah, there's a project." I waved him off. "Online, remote, not dusty work, but pays well." They didn't really believe it, of course, but didn't insist. Emily was happy that I finally stopped whining about being broke and started paying more attention to her. We began going to movies and cafes more often. I even bought her expensive perfume she'd been dreaming about for a long time. But something inside me was changing. I was becoming more withdrawn, irritable. My sleep became restless. I often dreamed of those worlds, those creatures. Sometimes it seemed to me that I could smell them, hear their voices even when I was in my apartment. Fear dulled, replaced by some cynical fanaticism. I saw things that would probably drive an ordinary person insane or make them go gray in one night. But I got used to it, or so it seemed to me. The phone became my constant companion. I checked it every few minutes, battery indicator, timer until the next order. This became more important to me than the time on regular clocks. I realized that declining an order reduced battery charge. Once I decided to experiment, declined some particularly tedious order. I needed to deliver a bucket of river water at midnight to the roof of a high-rise. The charge dropped from 95% to 70%. I panicked. What would happen if it died completely? The phone would die, and my golden goose would dry up. I never risked it again. I accepted all orders, no matter how strange or dangerous they seemed. One day the order was particularly creepy. Item: freshly cut strand of human hair, length at least 8 inches, color red, belonging to woman no older than 25. Destination: abandoned barbershop, quiet street, house number 9. Leave on old chair between 1 a.m. and 1:15 a.m. Recipient: doll maker. Payment: special. Note: hair must be cut voluntarily or without owner's knowledge. Violence not permitted. I went cold when I read this. Human hair, red hair at that. Where would I get it? Stealing, cutting from someone sleeping. This was already bordering on criminal. But the special payment intrigued me, and the fear that the phone would die spurred me on. I remembered Emily. She had gorgeous long hair, chestnut with a reddish tint. The thought that came to my mind was disgusting, vile, but it wouldn't go away. That evening, when Emily fell asleep at my place, she sometimes stayed overnight. I cut a small strand of her hair with trembling hands, using small scissors I'd stolen from her cosmetics bag. From the very back of her head, so it wouldn't be noticeable. My heart was beating like mad, and my hands were shaking. I felt so ashamed and disgusted as never before in my life. But I did it. The doll maker turned out to be a tall, thin creature in an old-fashioned suit with a face like a wax mask. He silently took the hair, examined it for a long time, then nodded. As special payment, I received an antique silver ring with a strange stone. The phone reported that the ring enhanced intuition and protected against mental attacks in some worlds. Useful thing, probably, but I felt no joy from it. Only bitterness and disgust with myself. This was the first time I really thought about whether it was worth it. Money, opportunities, but at what cost? I looked at my reflection in the dark window. A stranger looked back at me with cold, empty eyes. Where am I heading? But the next day, when the phone again offered an order, I again pressed accept. I couldn't stop anymore. It had become like a drug, the excitement, the danger, the anticipation of reward, and fear of losing it all, fear that the phone would die. I was becoming more and more reckless, began neglecting safety measures I'd developed for myself. In one of the worlds, resembling a giant library with living books that tried to bite or drag away their pages, I barely escaped because I decided to take a shortcut through a particularly dark and dangerous sector. Another time, delivering some glowing crystal to a creature resembling a huge slug in a world where gravity worked in jerks, I almost fell into a bottomless abyss. The ring received from the doll maker really helped sometimes. A couple of times I felt it start to vibrate on my finger, warning of danger, or how my head cleared when some creature tried to cast a spell on me. But it didn't make me invulnerable. Jason, that is, I was turning into a machine for completing orders. Cynical, calculating, ready for much for the sake of profit. I almost abandoned my studies. Relations with Emily became strained. She felt that I had distanced myself, become secretive, alien. Mike also looked at me with suspicion, but I almost didn't care anymore. I had my own life, my own secret, my own source of income that made me chosen. At least, that's how it seemed to me. I began to think about using the system for my own purposes. Maybe I could somehow contact the clients directly without the phone's mediation. Or find worlds where I could get something very valuable and sell it here, in our world. The phone sometimes gave strange artifacts as rewards. Maybe they were worth something. I began studying them, trying to understand their properties. It was dangerous, but the temptation was too great. I didn't yet know that I was already being watched, that my uniqueness and my sudden expenses had attracted the attention of those who don't like it when such toys fall into random hands, and that my crazy race for wealth and thrills would very soon come to its logical and terrible end. But for now, I was at the peak of my interdimensional courier career, feeling almost omnipotent. Fool. The further you go into the forest, the more wolves there are. I began to realize this simple truth on my own skin, though with great delay. The orders became increasingly sophisticated, and the worlds behind the portal doors increasingly hostile. The phone seemed to deliberately slip me the most dangerous and disgusting assignments, as if testing the strength of my nerves and the remnants of my conscience. One such test I remember particularly vividly. I needed to deliver a small, hermetically sealed lead container to a world that the phone app designated as Necropolis of Shadows. It already sounded ominous. The container was heavy and emanated a barely perceptible but very unpleasant smell. What was inside, the phone naturally didn't say. The recipient was listed as Mother of Crawlers. The portal opened in the wall of an abandoned crematorium on the outskirts of the city. The place itself made me shudder. Behind the door awaited a world of eternal night. The sky wasn't visible, only swirling black gloom from which moaning, howling sounds occasionally came. The ground underfoot was covered with ash and bones, small, broken, human, and otherwise. In the distance, silhouettes of some cyclopean structures resembling giant crypts or mausoleums were visible. The air was heavy, stagnant, saturated with the smell of death and decay. I walked, guided by the arrow on the phone screen, which indicated the direction to Mother of Crawlers. Around me, shadows constantly flickered, quick, shapeless. They slid along the ground, hid behind ruins, and it seemed to me that they were watching me. The ring from the dollmaker on my finger unpleasantly chilled my skin. Mother of Crawlers lived in the largest of the mausoleums. It was a huge, half-ruined structure, inside which darkness reigned, barely dispersed by the dim glow of some phosphorescent fungi growing on the walls. And there they were, hundreds, thousands of small, hunched figures resembling dried baby mummies or some ugly homunculi. They swarmed on the floor, on the walls, hung from the ceiling, making a quiet, disgusting squeak. This was the Crawler brood. And in the center of the hall, on a kind of throne made of bones and skulls, sat it Mother. A huge figure, bloated like a drowned person, with many thin, writhing limbs. It had no face, only a pulsating mass of flesh in which some openings resembling mouths or suckers could be discerned. From it came a wave of such horror and disgust that my knees buckled. "Brought child," creaked a voice in my head that made my blood freeze in my veins. I silently extended the lead container. One of its numerous limbs, resembling a bony spider tentacle, stretched out, grabbed the container, and brought it to where its face should have been. There was a quiet click. The container opened, and from there came a weak, plaintive squeak, the same as these little creatures around made. I understood. In the container was another child for this nightmarish brood, alive. I felt sick. I almost vomited right there on the bone floor. Why am I doing this? For what? Mother of Crawlers made some gurgling, satisfied sound. The container disappeared into its shapeless mass. "Good, take your payment." One of its limbs pointed to a niche in the wall. There lay a small, dimly glowing stone. The phone reported that this was a void stone, an artifact allowing one to create a small local vacuum once. Useless junk, in my opinion, but the order was completed. I grabbed the stone and rushed out of this cursed place without looking back. The disgusting creatures saw me off with their squeaking and rustling. Having gotten back to our world, I sat for a long time on the crematorium steps, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. The taste of bile stood in my mouth. At that moment, I hated myself, hated this phone, hated all this work. But the next day, when new order available appeared on the screen again, I again pressed accept. Because I had become addicted to the money, to the risk, to this feeling that I was touching something forbidden, otherworldly. And because I was afraid that if I stopped and the phone died, I would lose everything, and possibly someone or something would come for me to punish me for unfulfilled contracts. My life turned into a series of short respites in our world and dangerous forays into alien, hostile realities. I learned to be cautious, but also brazen when required. I learned to bargain with some clients. The phone sometimes allowed sending short reply messages if the creature was intelligent and accommodating enough. Sometimes I managed to negotiate additional rewards or information for myself. I began collecting my collection of artifacts received as payment. Besides the ring and the void stone, I got an amulet of silent walking that allowed movement almost soundlessly, dust of forgetting. A small bag of powder that, when scattered, caused some creatures to temporarily lose memory, and several other such trinkets whose properties I didn't always understand, but which could come in handy. I kept them in an old shoebox under the bed, my small arsenal of an interdimensional courier. Emily increasingly often made scenes for me. She didn't understand what was happening to me, why I had become so secretive, distant, why I constantly disappeared somewhere at night. I lied to her, making up some ridiculous excuses about night jobs, helping friends. She cried, said I didn't love her anymore, that I had someone else. It pained me to see her tears, but I couldn't tell her the truth. How could I explain to her that every night, risking my life, I delivered packages to monsters from other dimensions? She simply wouldn't believe it, or worse, would try to stop me, get into this business herself, and then I didn't even want to think about it. Mike also distanced himself. He tried a couple of times to get me to talk frankly, said I had gotten involved in something bad, that it wouldn't end well. I brushed him off or got angry. In the end, he just waved his hand at me. Watch out, Jason. Don't get too carried away, or you'll be biting your elbows later. But it'll be too late. He was looking into water, the devil. I really had gotten carried away. I began to feel like some kind of chosen one, almost invulnerable. The dangers of other worlds no longer frightened me so much, but rather excited my blood. I began experimenting, trying to open portals not only where the phone indicated, but also to other places, using the same doors, but at different times or with different keys, for example. Bringing to the door not the item required by the order, but one of my artifacts. Sometimes it worked short, unstable passages open to some intermediate, empty spaces where there was nothing but fog and silence. But more often nothing happened, or the phone began to vibrate angrily and show the message. Access error, protocol violation. The battery charge dropped slightly. And the most intriguing thing for me, I decided to try ordering something for myself. In one of the worlds, resembling a giant flea market, where creatures traded all sorts of junk from different realities, I saw an interesting artifact at one trader's. A creature resembling a huge beetle covered with fur and with many small hands. It was a small metal sphere that, according to him, could show echoes of the future. I really wanted to get it. Returning to my world, I tried to send a message to this beetle through the phone, offering an exchange or payment. To my surprise, an answer came. The beetle requested some rare earth mold for the sphere, which, according to him, was needed for his pets. I got the mold, had to mess around, crawling through several damp basements. And the next day, when the phone didn't give me a new order, this sometimes happened. There were weekends when there were no orders and the phone battery just slowly drained. I again went to that flea market. The deal was made. The sphere really showed some vague, fragmentary pictures resembling possible variants of the future. Most often it was nonsense, but a couple of times it helped me avoid trouble showing. For example, an ambush set up by some creatures in one of the worlds. I felt even more powerful. I'm not just a courier, I'm a player. I can influence the system, can get what I want. This was a dangerous delusion. It was during this period that I began to notice surveillance. At first, it was just a feeling that someone was watching me from behind when I walked down the street. Then I noticed the same unremarkable gray car a couple of times, which seemed to randomly appear near me in different parts of the city. I attributed this to paranoia, to frayed nerves. But one day, returning late at night after another raid, I was delivering concentrated moonlight to some creature, resembling a giant moth in a world where it was always night, and the moon was the size of half the sky, and shone so brightly it blinded you. I saw them clearly. Two men in strict dark suits stood by my building entrance, pretending to just talk. But when I approached closer, they looked at me in a way that made everything inside me go cold. This wasn't just interest. This was the look of hunters who had tracked down their prey. I quickly slipped into the entrance, locked the door behind me with all the locks. My heart was pounding. Who were they? Police, gangsters, or something else? The phone in my pocket vibrated, but it wasn't a new order. It was a message from an unknown number, typed in the regular messenger of my old human phone, which I almost never used. Jason Carpenter. We know about your unusual activities. We suggest meeting and discussing some details. It's in your best interests not to refuse. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Cozy cafe on the corner of Lincoln and Main. Table by the window. Don't be late. I felt like ice water had been thrown over me. They know my name. They know what I'm doing. But who are they and what do they want? I didn't sleep all night going over options. Run, but where? They seem to know everything about me. Go to the meeting. It could be a trap. But if I don't go, it'll only be worse. In the morning, I looked at the found phone. Battery charge, 65%. No orders. Apparently, the system was giving me time to think, or waiting to see how it would all end. I decided to go. I had nothing left to lose. I took the ring, the silent walking amulet, and the void stone with me, just in case. I also shoved the future-showing sphere in my pocket, though lately it had been showing only some mush. Cozy Cafe was an ordinary, unremarkable establishment. I sat at the table by the window as instructed. Exactly at 2 p.m., a middle-aged man in the same strict dark suit as those two by my entrance approached me. Unremarkable face, cold, attentive eyes. "Jason Carpenter?" he asked in an even, colorless voice. I nodded. "My name is Agent Thompson. I represent a certain organization that is very interested in artifacts like the one you have, and in people who know how to use them." He sat down across from me. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "We want your phone, Jason Carpenter, and all the information you have about the worlds you've been to. In exchange, we offer you amnesty and possibly cooperation under safer conditions." Amnesty, so they considered me a criminal. And if I refuse, I asked. Agent Thompson smiled. His smile was unpleasant, predatory. "I wouldn't advise it, Jason Carpenter. We know how to be very persuasive, and we have our own methods of working with people like you. Believe me, you wouldn't like it. That phone you're using is a very dangerous toy, and it shouldn't be in the hands of amateurs. It should be under control, under our control." He spoke calmly, but steel could be felt in his voice. I understood that these weren't empty threats. These people don't joke. "I'll think about it," I said. I needed to buy time. "Think quickly, Jason Carpenter. You don't have much time. Let's say until tomorrow morning. If you don't contact me and agree to our terms, we'll find you ourselves, and then the conversation will be completely different." He left a business card with a phone number on the table and left. I sat there, thunderstruck. The trap had snapped shut. What to do? Give them the phone. But what would happen to me? Cooperation. I didn't believe a single word he said. Most likely, they would just squeeze all the information out of me, and then get rid of me as an unnecessary witness. I left the cafe, my head spinning. I needed to think of something, and fast. I looked at the found phone. Charge, 63%. I decided to risk it. I pressed decline on a non-existent order. The charge dropped to 48%. One more such order and that's it. I need to complete an order, I thought feverishly, at any cost, to charge the phone. Then I'll disappear, go somewhere far away where they won't find me. Stupid, naive plans, but I had no others. I returned home. The phone was silent, no orders. I waited, nervously pacing the room. 1 hour, 2, 3, nothing. Had the system also turned away from me? And then, when I had almost despaired, the phone vibrated. New order available. Accept. Decline. I exhaled with relief and pressed accept. The order that the phone offered me that fatal evening was strange even by my standards, and frighteningly simple. Item: one child's rattle, any, previously used. Destination: old kindergarten number 27, playroom on 2nd floor. Leave on windowsill exactly at midnight. Recipient: the lost one. Payment: maximum. Note: do not turn around when leaving. A child's rattle. Abandoned kindergarten. The lost one. And maximum payment. This sounded like a trap, or like a last desperate bet in a game where my life was at stake. But the phone charge showed a critical 45%, and I had no choice. Finding a rattle turned out to be easy. I went to the nearest thrift shop and bought some old, shabby plastic thing for pennies. Kindergarten number 27 was located on the very outskirts of the city, in a half-abandoned area where no one had lived for a long time. The building looked like a horror movie set. Dark, empty window sockets, collapsed roof, overgrown yard, where the remains of swings and slides rusted forlornly. I got inside through a broken window on the 1st floor. Inside reigned desolation and gloom. Under my feet, broken glass crunched. I went up to the 2nd floor, guided by the dim beam of the flashlight on my old phone. The found portal phone didn't have a flashlight. The playroom, here it is. Peeled wallpaper with faded bears and rabbits, broken toys scattered on the floor. Small chairs overturned, as if children had run away from here in panic. I approached the window. Moonlight breaking through the dirty glass barely illuminated the room, creating bizarre, frightening shadows. Exactly at midnight, as the phone ordered, I placed the rattle on the windowsill. And then I heard it quiet, plaintive crying. Children's crying. It came from somewhere in the corner of the room, from the thickest shadow. I went cold. I wanted to turn around to see who was crying there, but the instruction pounded in my head. Do not turn around when leaving. The phone in my hand vibrated. Order completed. Payment transferred. Exit is where entrance was. Portal will be active for 5 more minutes. I slowly, trying not to make a sound, backed toward the door. The crying behind me became louder, more heart-rending. It seemed to me that it was following me, that small, icy hands were reaching for me from the darkness. I almost ran out of the playroom, down the stairs, and climbed out through the same window. Once outside, I caught my breath. My heart was beating like mad. I looked at the phone. Charge, 100%. The maximum payment was indeed maximum. An astronomical sum had been deposited to my account, enough for several years of comfortable life. But there was no joy. There was only a feeling of sticky, all-consuming horror. What was that lost one, and why couldn't I turn around? I needed to disappear right now. Pack my things, change my name, leave as far as possible. But I was too late. When I approached my house, that same gray, unremarkable car was already standing by the entrance. Those same men in dark suits, and with them was Agent Thompson. Jason Carpenter, his voice was cold as ice. We've been waiting for you. I see you decided not to accept our generous offer. Very bad. I realized this was the end. There was nowhere to run. "What do you want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The same as before, Jason Carpenter. Your phone and you yourself. We'll have plenty of time to chat." Two big guys approached me from both sides, took me by the arms. I didn't resist. What was the point? They shoved me into the car. Agent Thompson sat next to me. "You made a big mistake, Jason Carpenter," he said as the car started moving. "You thought you could fool the system, that you could play by your own rules. Naive boy. Even artifacts like your phone don't tolerate amateurism. They either subordinate or destroy. And we just maintain order." "Where are you taking me?" I asked. "Where you belong," he smirked. "To our little collection. We have many interesting exhibits there, and you'll become one of them." The car drove for a long time. Outside the windows, night streets flashed by, then suburbs, then dark forest. Finally, we stopped at some high fence with barbed wire. The gates opened. We drove onto a territory resembling a military base or secret research complex. Grim concrete buildings, bright floodlights, people in uniform. They brought me to a small, windowless room with bare concrete walls. One table, 2 chairs. They sat me on one of them. They took the phone away immediately. Agent Thompson placed it on the table in front of him. "So, Jason Carpenter," he began, "tell us everything you know about the worlds, about the creatures, about the orders, about the rewards. Don't leave out a single detail. The more detailed your story, the easier your further stay here will be." He looked at the phone, pressed the button. The screen remained dark. "Battery died?" he asked with slight disappointment. "Too bad. We hope to study it in working condition." "Well, okay. We have other methods of getting information." He nodded to one of the guards standing by the door. The guard approached and placed some instruments on the table. From the sight of them, a chill ran down my spine. The interrogation lasted several hours or days. I lost track of time. They squeezed information out of me like juice from a lemon. They threatened, pressured, sometimes used other methods too. I told them everything I remembered, described worlds, creatures, orders. I was broken, devastated. All my former bravado, cynicism, feeling of being chosen, all of it disappeared. Only animal fear remained, and the desire for it all to end as soon as possible. When they decided they had extracted everything possible from me, they threw me into a solitary cell. Small, damp, with a cot bolted to the floor and a bucket in the corner. Here I spent some more time, how much, I don't know. They fed me some tasteless slop, and once a day took me for a short walk in a concrete courtyard under the muzzles of automatic weapons. I thought this was my end, that I would rot here in this hole, forgotten by everyone. But one night the door of my cell opened. 2 men in masks entered, silently tied my hands, put a bag over my head. I didn't resist. I felt nothing anymore except dull, indifferent fatigue. They shoved me into a car again. We drove for a long time over bumps, then the car stopped. They roughly dragged me outside. Under my feet was uneven ground. It smelled of dampness and rotting leaves, some wasteland or forest. "On your knees," one of them ordered. I dropped to my knees. The bag on my head made it hard to breathe. I heard them standing behind me and heard the bolt click. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about money or Emily or Mike. I wasn't thinking about anything. There was only emptiness and waiting. I don't know what would have happened if I had taken that cursed phone to the police in the very beginning, or just thrown it away. Maybe my life would have been boring, gray, full of everyday problems and poverty, but it would have been mine. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.